Has higher ed made meaningful progress over the past year and a half or so?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think if reckoning is defined as remorse or white remorse, then yes, we've experienced a kind of racial reckoning. But if reckoning is about fundamental change, if it implies that we should be held accountable for actions, then no, we have a long, long way to go. Maybe at best, it's a moral awakening for many. Some have gained a kind of moral sensibility after watching the horrific killing of George Floyd. But again, to no longer deny Black humanity, I don't think equates to a reckoning, at least in my mind.
How do you think through this distinction at Arcadia as you're trying to advance both DEI and anti-racism with this anti-Black racism initiative?
Yeah, thank you so much for that background. And I mean, it's important to recognize the baggage that DEI comes with, so I really appreciate that. I think too many institutions, DEI in its traditional form, view it as sort of the new panacea for all our racial ills. Somehow it's going to solve all of our problems. And perhaps it can if we confront white supremacy and the privileges associated with it, if it promotes an anti-racism agenda, if it directly addresses the needs of marginalized communities. And I'll add, if we can fundamentally change the way in which we work to address injustice. In other words, that it doesn't all fall on the shoulders of our students and chief diversity officers. And this is essentially what we're trying to do at Arcadia. And I think, by the way, it's what a reckoning would look like. And typically through DEI work, at least in my experience, institutions are often just managing symptoms and they're not actually offering a cure, what we refer to as sort of changing the systems, right? Systemic change. We're simply kind of recirculating old ideas, the baggage, right, to tackle longstanding problems. And we end up feeling good about ourselves as we push for incremental change rather than the systemic change that our marginalized communities are calling for. And so for Arcadia, it's the DEI work reimagined, and we're now kind of doubling down on anti-Black racism initiatives, understanding that the entire community will be beneficiaries of that movement.
What role does training play on your campus? Who gets trained, or what does the training look like?
Yeah, I'll just say I agree with Dr. Wong Lau that the idea of mandating a training, which we don't do at Arcadia, I think philosophically I have an issue with, right? I mean, I think we're in the business of creating new ways of knowing and understanding in higher education. That's what we do. That's at the core of who we are. And I think that's difficult when you mandate something. However, and again, I'm just offering sort of the philosophical approach at Arcadia, when we have a culture where community members are maybe unmotivated to create a more just campus and maybe reluctant to decenter whiteness and all the norms associated with that, then we have to tackle that issue, right? And that's really hard to do through training. Not impossible, but that's really difficult to do. And that's where we're focusing a lot of energy at Arcadia. That's not to say that we're not doing trainings. The transformative work, I think, happens in that space. And again, to mandate something won't create the kind of cultural humility that we want in our community members, right? I think that work is inspired at a leadership level, by leadership through values, through accountability. And again, that's what we're trying to do at Arcadia. The other thing I'll add to is, while training and education efforts are really, really important, they shouldn't come at the expense of a focused anti-racism agenda. And we talked about that a little bit earlier, but I don't want to lose sight of that. Unfortunately, that is often lost in the training efforts on lots of college campuses.
What is the president's role in sort of leading diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? You obviously came to this role from a student affairs leadership role where you were sort of more directly interfacing with students. And now you're sort of at the top of the organization. What do you see as your role in advancing these issues?
Well, it's an important question, and I'll offer the insight that I have based on sort of 4 years of experience in this role. And I'll just say from a a presidential perspective, I would say that if an institution's strategic plan is not framed by justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, then it hasn't been prioritized, period. If it shows up as initiative number 46 in a 100-page document, well, then I would be concerned if I'm a stakeholder. And I could speak more to the mechanics of how that work can happen. It's been a long and challenging but fruitful process at Arcadia. But I'll speak even more broadly than just a strategy from my personal perspective, that we have to treat this work with a sense of urgency, with a kind of vigilance, and with creativity. And I say urgency because, and I don't think I'm overblowing this, I think people's lives are at stake. And I'm not just talking about our students, but community members. This work is critically important to our future. Vigilance because, look, we know that there are forces at work that are trying to undo the progress that we've made. And actually, there are people who we know are trying to harm individuals and communities. And so we have to stay vigilant. And I say creativity because, look, I say this a lot. I'm just going to say it in this space too. If we know that our past efforts have been unsuccessful or moderately successful, why do we keep on doing those same things? Why don't we innovate? Why don't we try to create best practice and figure out new ways of doing this work? And I think our panelists today are doing just that, and it makes me really proud. But I'll say ultimately, the role of a president and leadership is to lead the university strategy, which again should be framed by justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'll add one more layer to all of this, that university leadership should reflect the diversity of not only our community, but the world around us. So if our boards and our executive leaderships are not reflective, I think it speaks volumes about who we are and who we want to be. And I will say it wasn't an easy task at all, but when I came to Arcadia, I was not only the first person of color to assume the role of presidency, but I was the only person of color on the cabinet. Today, 4 years later, 50% of our cabinet are people of color and 70% are women. So it can be done. When people say that the pipeline isn't there, you know what, you have to be committed to this work. And I think things are possible. It does give me hope for the future.
How are you holding yourself and your leadership team accountable for progress?
Yes, Sarah, let me just start by saying, and we've said it maybe once or twice during this panel, but it's important to reiterate, the work shouldn't be happening on the backs of our students, right? I mean, we can't point to them and say, this is your responsibility. And even if sometimes we don't even say that so directly, but it's implied, right? That they should be doing the work that the university is responsible for. Yes, leadership needs to own and be held accountable for driving these initiatives with, of course, support and engagement with the entire community. As I mentioned before, just as an example, at Arcadia, we have about 50 anti-Black racism initiatives. And you might be surprised to know that the owners of the initiatives are my cabinet members. Everything from developing a Center for Race and Ethnicity to reviewing our bias incident protocols. There are 50 initiatives that were identified by our community, particularly our Black community, but it was a community-wide process. And we have prioritized those 50 initiatives, some smaller initiatives, some large scale. I am holding my cabinet members accountable for progress, and my board is holding me accountable because all of this is within our strategy. To give you a little bit more detail, to help drive the work, we enlisted project managers. And they're not necessarily direct reports of the cabinet members. They're folks who are passionate about the work, who have expertise in the particular initiatives, and many are working outside their traditional job role. And so we're offering some additional compensation to those project leaders. And again, this work is a community-wide partnership, meaning there are volunteers working with those project leaders, but accountability, again, is with my cabinet. So in other words, we're not just trying to create a more just campus, we're actually changing the nature of how we do this work, right? It's not relegated to one office or one person, right? The entire campus community, that's our goal anyway, should be engaged. So to create a kind of systemic change on these kind of issues of justice, I think we have to change the nature of work on college campuses.
Thanks, President Nair.
Transformation in higher education will come when we have decentered whiteness and white privilege. Transformation will happen when we actually come to grips with our colonial and our racist past. So just a few ideas, right? Just to reiterate some of the themes, at least that I've heard, we have to resource the work of justice and we have to prioritize it. The work definitely needs leadership from the very top of the organization, including the board. The work definitely needs input and output from all levels of the organization, of course, including students. And I think, as we heard from our panelists, we have to be unapologetic about our confrontation with white supremacy through an anti-racist agenda. And ultimately, we have to prioritize the needs of marginalized communities if we're going to be successful in this work.